And this will be presented by Medora Bornhoft.
Thank you, Chair. Yes. So unfortunately, this is going to be kind of lengthy presentation. So I'm going to thank you in advance for your attention on this. It is really important. We had a great presentation from Rebecca White from CDOT at last month's meeting. So this presentation will build a bit off of what she presented. At that time, CDOT's rule had not been released, and so her presentation was really a lot on the conceptual level behind what they were proposing for these greenhouse gas budgets, along with the background for why they were being developed. So what we're going to do tonight is present some of those background pieces as well, just as a reminder, go through the rulemaking schedule, describe the rule that CDOT is proposing that will be impacting the MPO's transportation plans and transportation improvement programs, dig deeper into a few topics like the role of modeling, the role of population growth, the feasibility of reductions, and the impact of the planning process, present the initial analysis from staff, and have discussion with the council. So the background behind this proposal that is coming out of the Transportation Commission and CDOT are two pieces of legislation and one state plan. The first piece of legislation is House Bill 19-1261, which set statewide goals for greenhouse gas reductions compared to 2005 levels out to 3 different horizon years. And so you see the reductions ramp up over time until 2050, where their goal is a 90% reduction. After that House bill was set, the state went and developed the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Reduction Roadmap through a multi-agency effort. And that included a lot of strategies and modeling to identify how the state could achieve those overall reductions within each economic sector. And so within transportation, it identifies a set of 6 or 7 strategies that could be pursued to help achieve those reductions. And it also identifies the amount of reduction that could be achieved within each sector. You'll notice for transportation, the reduction target is a little bit lower in the near term. So for 2030, it's 40% compared to the overall reduction goal of 50%. And that reflects that it's a bit harder to make big changes in transportation in the near term. There are a lot of individuals making choices. There's a long time for fleet turnover. So the reduction target is a bit lower for 2030. Looking out further to 2050, it's a higher reduction. It's a 99%. So you're almost eliminating pollution, the greenhouse gas pollution from transportation. The other big piece here is Senate Bill 21-260. That created new requirements for CDOT and for MPOs to account for greenhouse gas emissions in their plans. It defines certain terms such as disproportionately impacted communities that we were just talking about, and it sets certain deadlines for CDOT to develop these rules. And so that is why CDOT has developed this draft greenhouse gas rule. The notice was released earlier in August, mid-August. I'm not going to read everything on this slide here, but this is pulled from the notice, and it kind of identifies that concept scoping piece. So what the rule is revising the current statewide transportation planning process rules. It would propose a greenhouse gas pollution reduction planning level, which is sometimes called a GHG budget or a GHG target. Those terms are interchangeable. The goal would be to improve air quality, reduce smog, and provide more options for travelers. Both CDOT and MPOs would be required to establish plans that comply with those reduction targets and demonstrate that through travel demand modeling and air quality modeling. This slide shows the schedule for CDOT's rule proposal, along with some of the deadlines from 260 that relate back to what this rule is about. And so the official process kicked off in July when the TC authorized the rulemaking. Then, as I said, mid-August is when the rulemaking was noticed. We're currently in the 60-day public comment window, and that concludes on October 15th. There are 9 rulemaking hearings that CDOT is holding around the state, so that slide is a bit outdated and the dates are off as well. There are 2 that are going to be in Larimer or Weld County that I'll highlight later in this presentation. TC is scheduled to adopt the rule at their meeting in November. There's a bit of a lag time before the rule can become effective, so that's expected to happen in January. The next milestone on there is from the rule. There is a proposal for CDOT to identify a process for the greenhouse gas mitigation measures, and the proposal is for that to happen by April 1st of next year. And the last two milestones are from Senate Bill 260. 260 states that CDOT has to propose such a rule as this to the TC by July 1st. And so CDOT is doing good work getting it out in advance of that required deadline. And then there's a deadline for MPOs, specifically North Front Range and DRCOG and CDOT, to update plans in compliance with that rule by October 1st of next year. And updating a plan and doing the modeling associated with that takes some time. So we would want to have some time before October 1st to do that. So this slide provides the very high level summary of what's in that proposed revision. The bulk of it is Section 8. That's a completely new section on the greenhouse gas emission requirements, but there are also a few more minor changes earlier in the rule. So Section 1 has definitions for 19 new terms. Section 4.06 requires the statewide plan to include analysis of greenhouse gases and include the 10-year plan as an appendix. And Section 6.01 identifies how the 10-year plan will be amended by saying that CDOT will lead that process in coordination with TPRs. So Section 8 is what we're going to talk about the next piece of this presentation. There are 6 subsections. It identifies the greenhouse gas reduction levels in Part 1, how compliance is determined in Part 2, the greenhouse gas mitigation measures in Part 3, the role of the Air Pollution Control Division for confirming and verifying in Part 4, enforcement in Part 5, and then the last piece is a report required every 5 years from CDOT on greenhouse gas accomplishments around the state. So for the reduction levels, there are a few terms that we need to keep in mind. Baseline for this rule is a bit different than what you might think. So I think we often think of baseline as a fixed point in the past, but for this rule, the baseline is sort of the business as usual case for the future. So each year has its own baseline value based on what we're currently expecting based on population growth, employment growth, and the transportation projects that are in our plans currently. And so CDOT has baseline values for each MPO and for the non-MPO area based on those models. The next term is the greenhouse gas reduction level, and that's the amount of greenhouse gas that the MPO and CDOT would need to reduce through their transportation planning efforts to comply. And there are 4 compliance years, 2025, 2030, 2040, and 2050, which you'll see on this slide. This has the baseline and the reduction level for each MPO and for the non-MPO area for which CDOT is responsible for compliance for this rule. And just to walk you through it a little bit, so for the North Front Range line in 2025, this is saying that with our current forecasted growth and our current projects that we're planning, they're expecting we'd have 2.3 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions in 2025, and the rule is asking us to reduce it by 0.04 million metric tons. The other thing I'll point out is the total at the very bottom adds up the baseline and the reduction for each of these areas to give a picture of what it would look like across the state, but no one's accountable for that total. It's just kind of showing the overall impact. And then the other thing I want to point out about these reduction levels is how significant they are and how they change over time. So if you look at the reduction level as a percent of the expected emissions, that baseline value, in 2025, it's relatively small reduction level of 1.7%. That ramps up to a 6.7 or a 7% reduction by 2030. And then it goes back down again. And it's a little confusing at first when you look at it, but one thing to keep in mind is CDOT was considering how electric vehicles are being planned to be deployed and increase in our fleet. And as you have more electric vehicles in the fleet, the reductions you get in greenhouse gas through transportation planning diminishes over time because displacing miles traveled of an EV doesn't change your tailpipe emissions. And the lower end on 2025 also reflects the fact that it takes some time to implement these changes. And the other thing I want to point out here, I only did these analyses for North Front Range and CDOT, and then the statewide total. They're fairly similar within an individual year across the different areas. There's slight variation, but I think that might be due to rounding, but they are very close across the different areas. So this rule would be applicable to the Regional Transportation Plan and the Transportation Improvement Program for the North Front Range. There is an exception for TIP amendments, and that's because TIP amendments often are very minor changes to financials. And so this kind of saves an additional step while still having the TIP be, requiring the TIP to show that it complies. For CDOT, the applicable plans are the 10-year plan in non-MPO areas and the 4-year prioritized plan in non-MPO areas. And for CDOT, both amendments and new plans are considered applicable planning documents for this rule, which means they're subject to these requirements. The Greenhouse Gas Transportation Report is sort of the key piece in this. It's a new report that would be required for each applicable planning document. And it has 2 big elements in there, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Analysis and the Mitigation Action Plan. And again, there's a lot on here, and thank you so much for your time and attention on this. So Greenhouse Gas Emissions Analysis relates to the modeling that we do for our regionally significant projects, which are major capacity projects. The rule lets MPOs use their existing definitions for regionally significant projects, which is really helpful for us because we already have that in place for federal conformity for ozone. For us, a regionally significant project includes things like adding at least 2 lane miles of roadway capacity, adding or removing a major transit service, or adding a new intersection. So for those projects, when you put them in the model, they tend to show up and have more of an impact. So we have to do that modeling. The other piece is the mitigation action plan, and that is focused on the projects that don't qualify as regionally significant. And there are many projects that would still have a greenhouse gas impact, but they need to be measured in a different way through other tools than the travel model. And so that's what this accommodates, is allowing a demonstration for greenhouse gas impact through those smaller scale projects. In the mitigation action plan, you have to report on the estimated greenhouse gas reductions from those projects, co-benefits to other pollutants and to travel, and impacts to disproportionately impacted communities as defined in Senate Bill 260. The other thing I want to point out here is the definition for mitigation measures restricts it to just those projects implemented by MPOs and CDOT. And as you'll see later, the mitigation measures are much broader than what is typically implemented or can be implemented even by MPOs and CDOT. So that's one discrepancy I want to point out, and will come up again later in this presentation. So that greenhouse gas transportation report either needs to show that we're meeting the required reduction levels for each compliance year, or there are funding restrictions placed on the CMAQ and SDBG funds that the NFRMPO controls, as well as the 10-year plan funds controlled by CDOT for that MPO area, only for regionally significant projects. That restriction is those funds can only go toward projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So it's important to note here that there's no possibility of withholding the funds. The restriction is on which projects are eligible for those funds. And the other thing I want to point out here is there's a difference between the CMAQ and SDBG funds and the 10-year plan funds, which is that all 100% of the CMAQ and SDBG funds would be restricted to projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas for the 10-year plan funds, it's only the funds that are planned for the regionally significant projects that would need to meet this requirement. The non-regionally significant projects could still proceed. There is a verification and approval process specified in the rule. Air Pollution Control Division has the opportunity to provide a technical review. The report would need to be submitted to them at least 45 days before the NPO adopts the applicable plan. And the APCD has 30 days to provide that review. If they do not, the document is considered acceptable. Then the TC is responsible for approving, and they need to, by resolution, either approve the report, the greenhouse gas transportation report, or they need to, by resolution, say that it doesn't. There is no time limit for TC to make that determination. And if TC determines that it doesn't meet the requirements, then those funding restrictions are put into place, same as what I described on the previous slide. There is a waiver process in the rule. So if an area is not able to demonstrate compliance with those reduction levels and those funding restrictions take place, the MPO, CDOT, or the non-MPO TPR can request a waiver from the TC for those projects. They could also request a reconsideration of the TC's determination. On the waiver process, and for both of these, there is a 30-day window. So after the TC makes the determination, that request has to be submitted within 30 days as the rule is currently proposed, which could be very limiting for these types of requests. So within that 30-day window, if the entity asks for a waiver, they need to show that the greenhouse gas, or the TC will make the determination based on whether the greenhouse gas transportation report had enough priority placed on reducing greenhouse gas, and if you can show that the projects are not going to result in a substantial increase to greenhouse gas emissions. That term isn't defined in this proposed rule of what constitutes a substantial increase, so that could be a point of confusion in this process potentially. For the reconsideration process, the entity would have to provide an explanation of why they think the requirements are met when they submit that to the TC. The Transportation Commission would have 30 days or until the next TC meeting to act on either of these. And if no action is taken, the request is actually deemed denied. So they could deny it by not even taking up the request. The funding restrictions that I talked about have two different effective dates, and that's partly because of 260. So as I mentioned earlier, 260 has this requirement that North Front Range, DRCOG, and CDOT update their plans in compliance with the greenhouse gas rule by October 1st, and otherwise restrictions are placed on MMOF funds, the Multimodal Transportation and Mitigation Options funds. And so this rule points to that requirement in Senate Bill 260. Then it says after that deadline, for plans that are created and need to comply, if they're not able to comply, then it's the CMAQ, SDBG, and 10-year plan funds that are restricted. So it's a little bit tricky, but it's because of the 260 requirement for MMOF. But it's also interesting that the rule chose to restrict funds other than MMOF after the October 1st deadline. There are a few additional requirements I want to point out in this rule. There's a requirement for an intergovernmental agreement, and that will be between the MPO, CDOT, and CDPHE to address modeling assumptions. There's also the creation of a state interagency consultation team that could help address questions or issues around the definition of regionally significant projects. And that's sort of modeled off of what we do for federal conformity. We have an interagency consultation group that meets regularly. The last piece here is the annual status report. This is an annual report that we would have to submit on all of our greenhouse gas mitigation measures, including their implementation timeline, current status, the benefit quantification, and an explanation for any delays, cancellations, or substitutions. So, and if we do end up having a lot of greenhouse gas mitigation measures, it could be a quite extensive report to be submitting each year. As I alluded to earlier, the more work needs to go into the defining these greenhouse gas mitigation measures. Again, these are the non-regionally significant measures that can help reduce greenhouse gas. And so the rule has a timeline for CDOT to develop a process for that, to select those measures and quantify the impact. As part of that process, they'll be considering the impact of disproportionately impacted communities and determining how much credit to award for those measures. And the rule does have a list of potential measures. It's an illustrative list. It's not the end-all be-all. And so these are the examples that are put into the rule of what these greenhouse gas mitigation measures could be. It includes the addition of transit resources to displace VMT, improving ped and bike access, development and zoning improvements that would reduce transportation greenhouse gas emissions, improving first and final mile access to transit, changes to parking and other policies, electric charging and hydrogen refueling for medium and heavy duty vehicles, clean construction policies, and transportation demand management practices. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of these strategies aren't even available to MPOs. I'll point to the transit item. With our CMAQ and SVG funding that we have through the feds, there are restrictions in that we cannot provide ongoing funding for transit operations through either CMAQ or STBG. You can do a short-term operations through CMAQ, but it's limited to just a couple years, 3 or 5 years, depending. And so that's not a strategy that we can even fund through our available federal funding programs. And then land use is another clear example where the MPO doesn't not have land use authority, but what had been talked about during the stakeholder process is that through call for projects, there is the ability for the MPO to incentivize changes in the local government's practices. I'm going to pause there and see if there are questions from anybody on what's actually in the rule before we dig deeper into these topics of modeling population growth, the feasibility of the greenhouse gas reductions, and the impact to the planning process. And I know it's a lot to take in, so feel free to stop me at any time with questions, but I do want to pause now and see if there are any.
Great. Any questions so far?
I have a question about the mitigation tools that we're allowed to use. So is that something that we're gonna, when we comment in the rulemaking, that we would want to remind them that the MPOs don't have that ability to fund the operation of transit? I mean, are these some of the kind of things that we're going to bring up? I think it's great to have mitigation measures, and and maybe we can even think of some that we can add to this list. But to me, that seems like something we should remind them about.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Commissioner Stevens. I do have a listing towards the end of this presentation of staff recommendations. One of them is that the greenhouse gas mitigation measures should be able to be implemented by anybody in the region, including the local governments, and still count toward the region's achievement of these targets, because so many of these are actually being implemented by our local governments, and they have an impact. It is obviously more work to gather that information and report on it, especially with annual reporting, but that is one of the things we're suggesting to you all that we might suggest to CDOT.
Okay, so say because the MPO doesn't have control over that, even if a local jurisdiction implemented that, that should count as a mitigation measure for our MPO, is it?
Yes.
So if
that's one approach.
If transport creates a new route, or I don't know, that expands a bus rapid transit line or something like that, that would help towards our mitigation sort of the point system or whatever.
Yes, and one interesting thing to think about is with our regionally significant projects, it doesn't matter if it's through the MPO or if it's locally funded, it goes in there in that modeling either way. And so I think that kind of approach could make sense for these greenhouse gas mitigation measures.
Okay.
But I I also take your point that there could be other strategies we might want to consider that the MPO does have control over. I know more of this will come out when we go through that more extensive process that CDOT is planning to develop these measures. But if there are suggestions from MPO council members on strategies that should be in here, that'd be great to hear.
Great. I'd have to think about it, but I'm sure there might be other mitigation, measures that I can't think of at this point, but, certainly willing to mull it over. Thanks.
Yeah.
Medora, is there any thought to the most or kind of least impactful things? So let's use like Fort Collins as an example. They have a good transit program already, but if there's they add more improved bike and ped access more, or improve first and final mile access to transit, but maybe there's a different community that this could help more as far as our scores. Is that taken into account at all? As far as the actual greenhouse gas reductions, or is it kind of like we just need to start applying? We would need to start applying for those just to do it.
I'm so sorry. I'm not sure if I'm totally understanding the question. Is it about the impact in different geographies having a different level of impact where you implement the project?
Yeah, or populations actually affecting the score, or is they kind of looking at that like a template, like anywhere you put these things is the same amount?
Okay, that's a great question. There needs to be a lot more conversation about how these are going to be quantified, but we do have some experience through the CMAQ program. There is a toolkit available through FHWA that we've used for CMAQ that produces the ozone precursor reductions, and it also produces greenhouse gas emission reductions. And so based on those tools, it would matter a bit where you put it, because if you're able to put it in an area where there are a lot of short trips happening and more people can take advantage of that resource, you're going to be diverting more vehicle miles traveled.
Okay.
So I think that would be taken into account in the tool.
Yeah, the other thing is, well, I guess that's not a question. So my other question was regarding slide 12, greenhouse gas transportation report. What would be a good like real world example right now of something that would kind of get curtailed if we're not at our we don't hit our marks?
Okay, that's a great question, because this is very fundamental to what this rule is proposing. So if we were not able to demonstrate that we're meeting the reduction levels, then the restrictions would happen on all of the projects with CMAQ and SDBG funds. The rule doesn't specify when that kicks in. It could be immediately, projects that are in progress, or projects that have an IGA, or projects that are in our TIP and we have commitments to them and we awarded the funding to those projects and they haven't started yet. And that's something that's not clear in the rule as it's currently written. So it could be very disruptive potentially to all of those projects that we've awarded. And what it would mean is if we want to proceed with them, we'd have to submit the waiver to TC, demonstrate, and that's in this waiver process piece, that they won't result in a substantial increase in greenhouse gas emissions, and hopefully the TC would consider it and approve it.
Huh, okay. Thank you. Other questions before Medora moves on? Cool. I think you're good to move on if you'd like.
Thank you. All right, we'll start with role of modeling. Now, we do modeling already for our plan and for federal ozone conformity. So this is a very familiar process and will work relatively similarly for greenhouse gas. So we have a travel demand model that the MPO maintains. The state now also has a travel demand model for the state. These models incorporate the land use forecast, which account for the expected growth according to the state demographer, both in population and jobs. We have a network in the model of our transportation system, and we can add and remove projects. When we run the model, the outputs that we get include the mode of trips, so single occupancy vehicle or carpool, medium and heavy duty truck trips, transit trips, bike, and ped. The speeds on the roadway at different times of day are forecasted by the model, along with volumes on those segments. Transit ridership is forecasted, and then it also has forecasts for where those trips are starting and ending, or the origins and destinations. What we take from that are the roadway speeds and the volumes, and that gets put into the EPA Motor Vehicle Emissions Simulator Model, or MOVES. That's the official model for conformity, and CDPHE staff run it for everyone in the state. So it takes the outputs from our travel model, and it also considers additional information like vehicle classifications around the region, the age distribution of the fleet, and some other data sets that are from national defaults or from local sources. And what the MOVES model produces is ozone precursors. It can also produce greenhouse gas emissions in the carbon dioxide equivalents and other criteria pollutants if we needed to do that. So it's a process we're familiar with. One thing I do want to note here is table 1 that I showed earlier with the greenhouse gas baselines and reduction levels were based on an analysis that came out of the statewide model, not the MPO model. And when we go to demonstrate compliance with this, we are going to want to use the MPO model just because we have it in hand. We'll know it's up to date compared to the statewide model, which can be hard to coordinate those updates with another entity. So there is a difference there where what the rule is proposing is based on a different model than what we'd like to use to demonstrate compliance. What we have here are some preliminary results based on an analysis of our travel model plus the EPA MOVES model for greenhouse gas emissions in the entire northern sub area. So this is a larger area than what we would have to demonstrate compliance for, because we'd just be responsible for the North Front Range MPO. And the northern sub area is what we've done in the past because of the ozone requirement. It's about 4 times larger than the MPO area, and it includes pieces of I-25 that are outside of the MPO. So these figures are not comparable to table 1. But I wanted to present them to show the trends that we're seeing out of the travel model, and to say that we've also requested CDPHE to run a new analysis that is just for the MPO area and has some other updated assumptions in line with what's required for this rule. And they're working on that right now. We expect to have that next week. Commissioner James, happy to take your question.
Thanks, Medora. Obviously, you have put a ton of work into this, and I am impressed that you stayed awake during it. So congratulations. I'm a bit concerned about per capita situations. Obviously, I'm a commissioner from the state's fastest growing county, and we're going to double in size by 2050. And I just worry about, is this an apples to apples comparison? Can we get things to a per capita level? Is that a fair request?
I think so, and I'm going to dig into that even more in a couple slides. But you're right here. We're expecting a lot of growth, and we're expecting some growth in greenhouse gas, but it's really not that crazy compared to what we're expecting for population and employment growth. So on a per capita basis, we are expecting our greenhouse gas emissions to decline. The other thing this graph isn't accounting for is the current or forecasted share of electric vehicles. That definitely changes the slope of this line once you incorporate EVs. But yes, great question, and I will get into it further coming up here. So this is the last slide on the modeling debrief, and it's in 2 pieces. The first piece is on the baselines. So some of the issues with the baselines that are in the rule are that it's based on the statewide travel model, not the MPO model. And also they did a bit of a proxy process. So instead of pulling out the greenhouse gas from each geography from the MOVES model, they looked at the statewide total greenhouse gas and then apportioned it out based on VMT. And we know that greenhouse gases are not directly related to VMT because If you have a very congested transportation system, you're going to have a lot of idling and emissions that aren't actually taking you somewhere. And so it's a function of both VMT and congested speeds. And so what's in the table isn't a great reflection of what we'd actually be doing when we go to demonstrate compliance, because we would actually have the greenhouse gas emissions for our area, which goes back to the request that I discussed of our request to CDPHE to run that analysis for the MPO area. Then on the reduction level piece, there's no explanation in the rule or any published documentation of how those reduction levels were determined. We do know through conversations from CDOT that there was 3 scenarios that were developed and modeled, and that's how they came up with the reduction levels. And I do have a summary of those on this slide. So the first scenario they tested was travel choices. The second one was transit, and the third was land use. And these were actually sort of layered on top of each other. So the level 1 was only travel choices. Level 2, they did travel choices and transit. And level 3 was an all of the above type scenario. And the strategies that were included in these scenarios were fairly aggressive, tripling telework from 6% to 18%, increasing broadband availability to households, and those households with new access to broadband would then decrease some of their trips. Extensive sidewalk and bike improvements, reducing the speeds in arterials. I'm not going to cover all of these. In the transit scenario, there's a 6% annual increase in service year over year in the short term, increasing service after that, leading to a doubling of service levels by 2050. And in the land use scenario, it increases the amount of growth in mixed use areas from 10% up to 50%. That's for the North Front Range. They had different amounts in different areas. So one of the questions we have are these greenhouse gas strategies that were used to set the reduction levels applicable to MPOs? Are they things that we can achieve through the strategies we have available to us? They are quite aggressive strategies.
Right. Medora, with the 50% transit fare, is that 50% reduction as a suggestion?
Yes, yes, that's what they modeled this. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Well, yeah, I'll stay on this. Any questions on the discussion on modeling before I move to the role of population growth? All right, seeing none. So population growth and job growth is accounted for in the budgets because it's part of our travel model and part of the statewide travel model. It uses the assumptions from the state demographer. For our region, as we all know, we're facing a lot of growth, 83% growth in population, 67% growth in jobs over a 30-year time frame. And so the budget that CDOT set for each compliance year reflects that growth. But there are 2 issues that we see as staff in the approach that was taken. One issue is that MPO boundaries can change, and that can either be through the choice of the MPO, or it could be required after a decennial census if the urbanized area changes. And so what would be counting toward our budget in the future could be different. The other big thing is that growth forecasts are updated every time we do a new RTP. That's a best practice, and it's a federal planning requirement that we use the latest assumptions on growth. And so we go and get those assumptions from the state demographer, and they're going to be higher or lower than what was predicted previously, most likely. So the suggestion of setting a reduction level in greenhouse gas per capita would address these 2 concerns, because even if your MPO boundary changes or your growth forecast changes, you could still have a greenhouse gas reduction level that reflects what you're expecting for your region. There is another option here where we could reset the reduction levels each time either of these things change. One potential issue with that is that each of the MPOs have their own cycle for updating their plans. And so if this rule would need to be revised every time that happens, you'd probably end up with a revision every year, which doesn't seem like a great use of resources. So yeah, this is the one slide on population growth. Any other comments on this slide, on this topic? All right, we'll move along. So feasibility of reductions. The greenhouse gas emissions analysis, which is the piece focused on the major projects, those regionally significant projects. What we're seeing out of the travel model is that there isn't a substantial impact of not building these projects in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but we don't know the full answer because, as I said, we have those requests out to CDPHE and they're working on them now. What we see is it doesn't seem like there's a significant VMT impact, and there could actually be a beneficial impact on roadway speeds where you have less idling and less congestion by building the projects. So we still have a question mark on that piece. For the off-model analysis for those projects that are not regionally significant, the process for quantifying that still needs to happen, and it's going to be happening outside of the rule. So we don't have a good sense of how far those projects could take us, if they could really complete the full reduction level that would be needed. We did some analysis on projects that we've funded through CMAQ, and the furthest we could get was 10 to 15% of the needed reductions. But this is another question mark where we just don't know how feasible the greenhouse gas reduction levels are, and more data is needed to understand that. Any questions on this topic? We can always go back and address additional questions or thoughts. So last digging deeper topic is the impact of the planning process. So we are required through the federal planning rules to address 10 planning factors when we do our metropolitan plan. I'm not going to read those factors, but they're on the screen. And there's also a requirement for surface transportation block grant funds that we cannot provide the funds to a certain transportation mode through a preset formula or percentage. You know, the goal really is to have a comprehensive look at your system and fund the greatest needs. And so we do have some questions out about how this rule would interface with these federal requirements to have a comprehensive planning process. All right, next few slides are the areas of support and the areas of concern that were identified by staff. So for areas of support, the purpose of this rule for reducing greenhouse gas, reducing ozone, and expanding transportation options are really great and are needed. And as I mentioned earlier, they're required through the state legislation. We also support the existence of the waiver process to help projects that are important to the region be able to proceed. Establishing the greenhouse gas mitigation measure process outside of the rulemaking is beneficial, even though it does leave some question marks about what that's going to look like. It also gives additional flexibility so that mitigation strategies can be updated more easily and included in that list. The creation of the state interagency consultation team will be helpful for addressing issues as they come up. And another area of support is that the rule does not propose withholding funds from the MPO. For areas of concern, what staff has identified is that the greenhouse gas reduction levels may not be feasible, and I think I've covered that a fair amount already. The next one is the rulemaking schedule may not accommodate data-driven requirements or data-driven comments. And a few additional comments here. There appear to be some errors and some incomplete pieces of the modeling that was conducted by CDOT. And we've had discussions with them, and they have proposed reanalyzing those budgets, but that would take some time to do. I've already mentioned that we've requested the analysis from CDPHE, and that's underway. And lastly, the documentation, as I mentioned, has not been released. We do know that CDOT is working on that, but there is no timeline of availability for that documentation. Another area of concern is that the rule should require a periodic reassessment of the greenhouse gas reduction levels. This could either be a number of years or maybe certain triggers that would require a group to relook and see if they need to be changed. This was a suggestion during the stakeholder process that didn't make it into this draft rule Another area of concern, we've gone through this pretty well. It's that the MPO boundary could change and the population forecast could change. And so a per capita budget or a way to revise those baselines and reduction levels would be helpful for the MPOs. Another area of concern is many of those greenhouse gas strategies are outside of the control of MPOs and CDOT. We've covered this on the land use authority. MPOs don't have that authority and they have a very limited ability to encourage land use changes. And we don't have the ability to fund transit operations through CMAQ or STBG. The implementers of the greenhouse gas mitigation measures should not be limited to CDOT and MPO because there are efforts underway by local governments that could make an impact and could be counted. Another concern is the rule lacks specificity on some of the processes, roles, and responsibilities of different agencies. So as I mentioned, there's no specified timing for TC to determine if the greenhouse gas transportation report complies with requirements. It's unclear when the funding restrictions would occur, if it would occur to projects already in process or with IGAs. And there is a lack of a process for addressing any of the concerns that could be raised by APCD during their technical review, as a few examples of those. The greenhouse gas mitigation measure reporting process could be onerous without providing much value, if we do have a lot of measures in there being reported annually. And then the last area of concern is on which projects would be restricted. So as I mentioned, the 10-year plan funds, that restriction on projects that reduce greenhouse gas is only for the regionally significant projects. Non-regionally significant projects funded through 10-year plan could still go forward without a waiver. That's not the case for the CMAQ and STBG projects, where all of them, whether they're regionally significant or not, would need a waiver unless they reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. So I know we want to have some robust discussion here, but I do want to cover a few more slides before we get into that. So next steps, we have today's council discussion. We are planning a joint work session for September 16th between the TAC and the council to discuss these topics further, because coming up after that is one of the rulemaking hearings located in our region. On September 30th is the hearing in Fort Collins, and on October 5th is the hearing in Firestone, I believe. We will have another discussion or action at the October council meeting, depending on how far along we are in discussing this, and if we need more time, we could have another work session on October 14th. And then October 15th is the deadline to submit public comment to CDOT. And I do have the link on here to access the proposed rule and the notice from CDOT. So if you haven't seen that, I think we all probably got 5 or 10 emails with that, but if you haven't seen it, the link is there. There are 9 rulemaking hearings, as I mentioned, and so I just wanted to highlight these on this slide, show where they're happening around the state. They are hybrid hearings, so you can attend in person or you can register and attend virtually. And then these are the discussion questions we have to help lead this discussion. I'd like to just read through them all and then see what sticks, and hopefully we can get to all of your thoughts and questions. So the first question we have is, should the NFRMPO submit a letter to the TC hearing officer requesting more time for the rulemaking? And that's not a concept I covered, but there is a hearing officer designated for this rulemaking who will be leading the process for the Transportation Commission. Second question, does council want to designate a council member to provide policy comments at the rulemaking hearings on September 30th and October 5th? NFRMPO staff could be available to attend, or would be available to attend, and could provide the technical comments at those hearings. I want to know what questions you have on the proposed rule and initial analysis. What other information you would need to understand this complicated rule, and what concerns and suggestions do you have? So thank you so much for all of your time and attention, and I'll turn it over to the chair to see if there are any thoughts or questions.
That's amazing, and the work that you guys are all doing on this is not lost on me, and I think a lot of others. This is a huge bear, so thank you for all your work so far. Do you mind commenting on the letter, I know North I-25 might be sending one as well, and then also some push for municipalities maybe. It seems like we're all kind of might be asking for the same thing to have more time.
Yeah, that could be that multiple entities will be requesting that. Suzette, do you know more?
Yeah, I think one of our issues that we're having is we're so used to going through a rulemaking process with the Air Quality Control Commission that has very hard deadlines for a lot of things. It's not that way with the Transportation Commission. And so we really don't know what is our deadline for asking for that kind of an extension. Do we need to ask it with the STAC and the TC this month? Do we get to wait till October 10th and ask for that extension? We don't know. Commissioner Brackey has sent that question to the legal authority at CDOT to ask sort of what is that process. But we're sort of waiting to hear back about what that timing is. I guess we're assuming, or I'm assuming, that request would come through the STAC and the TC at the September meeting. I mean, we may be done and have everything we need before October 15th, but we don't know that because we don't have the data that we've requested yet.
Right,
So,
okay.
So the timing's unknown, but I think, it would make sense that we would send the letter to the hearing officer requesting it. We just don't know when we should be sending it.
Okay, I was just kind of asking that to start a conversation because I think for me, what other information do you need to understand the proposed rule? Well, to me, it's a little giving staff time to have more accurate information. But that's it. Commissioner, it looked like you had a comment here.
Well, it's a definitive comment, Will. I appreciate the work of everybody involved, but let me read direct from their website, CDOT's mission statement. The mission of the Colorado Department of Transportation is to provide the best multimodal transportation system for Colorado that most effectively moves people, goods, and information. What does any of this have to do with CDOT's mission? And why can't I get an answer to that question? This is mission creep, period. And that's all I have to say about that.
Thank you. Any questions relating to this slide here, discussion questions to help out conversation here?
Well, I can answer some of the questions of how I feel. I do think we should submit a letter requesting more time for the rulemaking. So whatever the timeline is on that or the protocol, it sounds like we'll find out from Kathleen, but I do think that's important. And I think that Dave is going to the STAC and will reiterate that message. I suggested it in the last STAC meeting that I attended to. So I think the more we kind of, let them know we need more time, I think that's important. I do think it would be valuable to have a council member to provide policy comments all alongside of staff. Staff could give kind of a more technical comments, and council member could give kind of more practical comments or more anecdotal feelings on how our MP is feeling about that. I mean, I guess I don't have any questions. I think it was pretty thorough, so I thank you from Dora and Suzette and everyone involved with kind of dissecting this. I probably need to sit with some things to see if I don't know that I fully understand it, all the implications, but if we can't comply with this rule, I mean, if we already know that we probably can't comply and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions to the level they want, I mean, that's certainly problematic. And so I think that, we need to definitely express that. And so I guess those are my concerns that I have.
Okay, yeah, and I appreciate that. Just if anyone wants to go down, it doesn't all have to be questions here. I will say with the second point, I'd be happy to. In fact, I'd love to help out staff and go to these to the rulemaking hearings on 9:30 and 10:05. Unless someone doesn't want me to go or really wants to do it, I'd be happy to do it. So, Councilmember Clark.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to follow up on that, as Kristen mentioned, we got the stack meeting next week, and we'll talk about that, I guess. I certainly think we need more time on this. I mean, Medora and the crew did a tremendous job of dissecting and going through that whole thing. And with all due respect to any thinking person, there's so many questions in there. How in the world can we possibly think to just go ahead with this? It reminds me of, the old happened in the past. Well, we just need to pass it and then find out what's in it later. That's really sad. And Kristen, I really appreciate your comments that we need to study this more and understand it. And like you say, it doesn't seem like we can even comply with this over the years. So it makes you wonder what the real purpose behind this whole thing is. And I better not get into that, because then we're getting into different opinions and stuff. But anyway, that's kind of my comments. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, I think, I don't want to interrupt anyone, but I think no matter where you stand on this, to me, this is a great unifying thing, is we just need information. It's really frustrating when David does feel, even for me, maybe being on the opposite side of this, it does feel like this is getting rammed down our throat. So I think there's a good uniting thing here of, hey, we can't really do anything unless we have time here to really sort this out and be able to provide you accurate information. Otherwise, it just kind of feels rigged. And I'll shut up now, because now I'm getting into politics. Any other comments, questions?
I'll just hop right in there with, my statement is legitimate. I'd like an answer. After that, I agree that we definitively need more time. I think it's interesting that the word has been used by multiple council members, compliance. You shall comply, and if you don't have the ability to do so, you will be punished. And it's that simple. I don't care who said that this is not meant to be a punitive ruling. You can't convince me of that. There are only so many things that I'm willing to buy, and the fact that this is not meant to be a punitive effort is one I will not buy. I thank you. I am a bit more intelligent than that. And that being said, we need more time, and I think the entirety of this council needs to be polled before any policy statement is made. I think we can agree on one thing: we need more time. Beyond that, if we can't come to a majority in our opinion on this council, one should not be offered.
And by that, you mean opinion on going forward or to oppose? I mean,
we can rage against this machine all we want, Will. It's being crammed down our throat. It's mission creep on the part of the Colorado Department of Transportation. I'll stand by that, but it matters not, because in the robust stakeholder meeting in which I spoke up time and time again, it almost became a game to ignore those who had my point of view. Mm-hmm. That being said, what can we agree on right now? The fact that we need more time.
Right. Okay. That's what I was trying to clarify. I heard the word poll, and I was trying to pick up on that.
Well, and Chair, I think from that perspective, I would guess, hearing from everybody who's spoken so far, that there is a unified voice right now saying, look, we need more time to understand as an MPO what it means for us that we are, and Commissioner Stevens, I think you're right, whether or not we can comply, we don't know, right? And so we need more time to understand what that means for our communities, what that means for this MPO. And then if we can't comply, we need to understand what the punishment piece means. So from that perspective, I think if that's the message you're carrying down that week, congratulations. Sounds like you've been nominated and elected. I would join you. I am in trial that first full week of October, which also means the week before I'm out of commission. So I would join you, but I can't do so. But I think that's what it sounds to me like. That's a fair statement coming from this council.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I would think we all presumably agree. I mean, I think that there's definitely probably some disagreements that we all have, but I think we agree on the findings that were presented, that the concerns that the MPO has about this, that were listed on the page a couple pages before. I mean, I bet we all agree on those too. So in addition to the time piece, I bet we all agree that, because I do think that it's likely, the areas of concern. I can't imagine that we don't agree on some of those too. I mean, the fact of the matter is we can, hopefully we will get more time. If we don't, I think we need to express some of these concerns, because if this goes into effect, we'd like to affect it as best we can, and so I think it's really important to make sure that those concerns are heard. So in addition to the time factor, I think we need to be able to express these areas of concern, which are 2 pages long. So.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, Commissioner, and not for no particular reason, the one really stood out to me is creating land use requirements and then pushing them through an entity that has no ability to do anything about that. What are we supposed to do as a council relative to? Are we supposed to now push down land use application requirements to every single municipality? That's baffling to me. But so I would agree with that. I think maybe that's even a great place to start, is just to say, here's our I didn't count them all, but here's our list of concerns that need to be expressed.
I
I agree with that too, and I think that goes to Commissioner James's point of that question, Commissioner James, as far as CDOT's role in this, and now we're getting into land use and stuff and construction waste diversion. But I agree with Commissioner Stevens, and Councilmember Payton does sound like a great point, or a great way to go about this.
I agree, Mr. Mayor. The list of concerns is certainly a valid one, and there's nobody on this call that hasn't heard me rage against the machine when I say that it is not the proper role of the Colorado Department of Transportation to meddle in land use. That remains the sole propriety of local governments. They ignore me anyway. That darn statute gets in the way again. But yeah, we could agree on the concerns.
Great. Let's see here. Laney agrees, would like more time and info. Okay. Anyone else? Or staff, do you have any questions?
I am wondering if there's any other information I can bring forward that would help you all. And I know part of that is what I've mentioned, that we're waiting on data. And so once we get that, we will be bringing that to you. But is there anything else you can think of that would help you understand this rule better, or what the implications are?
Yeah, right now I'm kind of like Kristen. I think we've all done a fair amount of research on this, but it's really just rolling out in my head how this is going to affect. I guess a concern I have right on the bat here is how we're just so different in size and demographics and whatnot. How equally projects can go about. If you don't have a transit system which affects a bunch of these criteria, well, you're kind of left out. And we'd be focusing elsewhere and in an attempt to get these points, I guess. But I'm hesitant to even bring that up, because I just really need to filter this and run it through my board and hopefully have more robust discussions. Sorry, I interrupted somebody. Who was that?
Yeah, that's okay. Well, just my comment. This is Dave. Medora, I don't think there's any more that you can provide for us. You've done everything you could, every which way on this thing, and you're just coming up with all kinds of questions because the answers aren't there. So when you ask what more can you do, go to sleep, go to bed, go rest. You've done a lot. I think we got to get some more information from the state and let them come up with these answers. That's my opinion. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, that's great.
So I do have one request, is that Medora, could you go back to the meetings slide, if you wouldn't mind? So we have talked about, since this is the one for MPO, thank you, that one. Because this has got so much in it, and we don't know when we're going to get the data, but we think it would be very helpful if we convened you guys a little more frequently than once a month until we get through this rulemaking process. So does September 16th is sort of the tentative date we're thinking? It would be sort of halfway between the TAC and the council meeting. We'd like to do that joint work session. We'd also like to, maybe hold out another a joint work session on October 14th if that becomes necessary to finalize things before the public comments are due, because our intent is we'd really like to get council's approval on our comments before they get submitted. So is council okay with us scheduling those 2 meetings? I'm thinking probably an hour and a half is what most people can endure for a meeting of like this. Does that work for you? And I see Lainey saying that is the town board night. That's a conflict for Lainey. Any other thoughts? We could do Friday, maybe the 17th.
And we were thinking.
Go ahead.
Well, could we do them? If we do them virtually, Scott, you could have a bourbon. So, and for me,
Just one. All I ask is one.
I fully support that, and I think a virtual meeting would be actually good if we could do those 2 virtually. That would be helpful to me, and I can be available either that Thursday or Friday. And I think it's a good idea for us to meet again.
And Lainey says 17th would work. This is September. Oh, yep. Okay.
Is there a time on those?
I'm a year off.
Yeah, one of the times we were thinking of was 9:30 on the 16th, instead of doing an evening meeting. And the other thing, does that work for people?
I mean, we've done this before with when Barb had us kind of do that big 10-year plan. We had that special meeting, and I can't remember what time we did that. This afternoon, actually. Morning works for me too, though.
Yeah, that was like a midday one. That was like 2 to 4 or something like that.
It probably makes sense to get the most participation. It would have to be an evening just for elected officials with day jobs.
But would it work to start like 4 or 4:30, or should we wait until later in the evening?
Personally, I think 4 or 4:30, but I wonder how many people on this can't get to a place till at least 5:30 or 6 or something.
I'd be willing to offer to trade somebody to go to any of the 3 court appearances I have on the 16th.
If you want me there.
I was gonna say, do you want us to try that case for you, Brett? All I need is a bourbon, and hell, I might win. You never know.
I prefer tequila before trial, but that's fine.
So the 17th, Lee said could do, and that's a Friday. Does anyone would Friday at 4:30 work?
I think that, should we just send around a doodle poll and maybe try to find something, via email, and then we can just pick the time when most people can make it?
Yeah, it's a solid idea.
I like
because
that.
I could do the 16th, but I like that idea, Commissioner.
Great.
Will do.
That works. Suzette, can you doodle poll?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I also will say that I appreciate you jumping in and saying that you would speak at these public hearing meetings, because I think having council voice, not just staff voice at these meetings, I think is going to be huge. And I think that makes a big difference. So
sure, I'm happy to. I think it's part of my role as well, and I'll work with you ahead of time, so we're on the same page.
Okay. Yeah, but I just want to say I really appreciate that, because, having council support, even though staff is doing the technical work, it's your voices that help make the difference.
Sure. I will point out, Medora and Suzette, if you guys look at the chat, how many people are very appreciative of the work you guys have done so far on this. So a ton of support and appreciation for you guys. I'm going to read the rest of these. Homeschool. Okay, so it looks like a lot of these can be handled by the doodle poll. Is there anything else before we close this item out? Sounds like we got everything covered.
I think one more thing, and I think that's the last question. If you think of something between now and the next meeting, feel free to email me or Medora and say, hey, you know, what about this in the rule? And we can either try to help answer that, or we can add it to the list.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to do is see if we can get a brief version, a smaller version of this like Medora has presented on before, at least with the town of Berthoud. Would love to have a presentation on this if possible, just so the rest of the trustees on our municipality know what's going on. Okay, sounds like we've covered everything on that. Anything else? Is that Medora? Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. All right, well, that concludes our regular agenda. We can move on to reports now. And we'll start out with Commissioner Brackey with the Transportation Commission.
Great. Good evening. And I just want to add my thanks and appreciation to Suzette and Medora for all of the incredible work on the GHG rulemaking. I mentioned this earlier today at the Upper Front Range meeting, but I've been sitting through a lot of different presentations from different groups on the GHG rulemaking